You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with my wife, Cassandra. So today's a very interesting subject. Every week I say this, but today is mycotoxin testing. So when you hear me say that, what comes to mind for you?
Emma is what comes to mind for me. That's the first thing that comes to mind because that's the type of test. One of them, I'm assuming, that will evaluate mycotoxins. Or is it the only one?
No, it's not the only one. So for our listeners, EMMA is Environmental Mold and Mycotoxin Assessment.
Okay.
It's a mycotoxin test for your home. You asked a very interesting question because that's not the only test that you can test for mycotoxins in a home. There's, I believe it's called Respirair. It's an air test for mycotoxins. There's also Haze Microbial, which is a dust sample just like EMMA is.
Yeah, so there are a variety of them. But to go back to your original question, mycotoxins are interesting to me because one of the things that comes to mind with mycotoxins is that they're what the toxic molds spew to protect themselves when they feel like they're under attack.
Yeah, by definition, a mycotoxin is the byproduct of a toxigenic mold species or colony, infestation, whatever you want to call it. But the way you said it is an interesting way. Like, it's kind of an off gas.
Yeah, it's kind of like when I always say that the beans, like beans, lentils, when we consume them, for many of us, I think it's the lectins. That's sort of their attack mechanism in our guts.
Right.
To make our stomachs upset, to say, don't eat us again.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the mycotoxins are the equivalent in toxic mold.
Yeah. And a lot of my clients that have hired me for whatever remediation inspections, they'll know. They're probably saying, yeah, I know what you're going to say, Steve. But what I compare mycotoxins to all the time, either a snake or a porcupine. What does a snake do to defend itself?
Venom. Coming out of the teeth, right?
But exactly, out of the fangs. But are all snakes venomous?
No.
So, similar to mold, a porcupine, what does it do to defend?
The quills come out.
Yes. The reason I use the porcupine analogy is once that quill comes out, does that quill follow that porcupine everywhere?
No.
It's a totally separate entity.
Yeah.
And it goes back to, we were talking about an SPC several weeks ago. Those mycotoxins can end up anywhere in the home.
Correct.
That's why I use the porcupine analogy, is because most people think they only have to deal with the toxic mold, when in all reality, I'm not saying molds don't make people sick. They of course do, but what makes them really sick is the mycotoxin.
Correct, because the toxic mold, while it's active in a mold colony, can have the off-gassing of the mycotoxins. But then once the mycotoxins are in the air, they're still doing their thing even when you take care of the mold colony. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Which, going back to an SPC, that's why an SPC is important. Now, is it the end-all be-all? Like, do you go through the forest if you're trying to get rid of porcupines and find the quills? No. You want to find the porcupine.
Correct, yeah.
Which,
the source.
And that analogy is the mold colony.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that quill cannot reproduce and make more quills.
Correct. So mycotoxins can't reproduce and make...
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
And I say it that way because there are white papers, which for our listeners, white papers is like the research side of it. Every scientist or microbiologist or doctor has differing opinions. But I have never seen any white papers that state mycotoxins can reproduce without the mold.
Yeah. But once, I guess my question for you is, when the mycotoxins are produced and they're just in the air and so they're light and they can travel all over the house, do they have the same negative health impacts on people that the toxigenic mold in the mold colony does?
I think it's the mycotoxin that is affecting those that are really sick from mold.
Huh.
That's a very difficult question to answer because the mold colony is what's producing the mycotoxins.
Correct. So you get rid of the mold colony so that it doesn't produce any more mycotoxins. But I think where people have issues is they think, well, we got rid of the mold colony by doing mold remediation, so everybody should be feeling better.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying is that, well, yes, and the mycotoxins were already off-gassed.
Right.
So you might not be feeling better because even though you got rid of the mold colony, the mycotoxins are still all over the house, and that's what's making somebody in the home sick.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're both a concern. A lot of my fellow professionals that are listening, because we know a lot of them do, they're probably not going to agree with me on this. But going back to what you're saying, like the mold colony itself is, to me, the number one thing you should focus on. I'm not huge on you have to do remediation and you have to do an SPC just to start feeling better.
Yeah.
That's where my fellow professionals are probably, and that's okay. We don't all have to agree. But I think what you're getting at is like what should be addressed first, right?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is even if you address the first things first, which is the mold colony, if you don't also address the mycotoxins that were already put into the air by the mold colony, somebody in the home might not, based on their immunological makeup, they still might not be feeling better, even though
and that is correct. Yeah. But on the other hand, like I approach it more of let's lower the burden, because I know not everyone has money trees. I don't think anybody does, obviously. But that's where, like, if you're doing remediation and then you're having to pay us to do an SPC, like, that's a lot of money. And so for our listeners, if we all have a limited amount of money, if you only have $30,000, should you try to get a handyman to fix the mold issue and then pay me to do the SPC? I'd be like, no. But on the other hand, I get where you have to appropriate funds in certain areas. And I would say, get the professional like myself to do the remediation.
Correct. And I want to go to this concept of load because everybody might not understand or have listened to enough of this podcast to understand what you mean by load. Can you explain, when you say reduce the load, what does load mean in this case?
So the analogy Dr. Diane, Dr. Fox, most of the medical professionals say is think about a bucket. When you're born, that bucket is empty. As we all get older, that bucket starts to fill up. Let's say you're a diabetic. And if you're diagnosed as a diabetic as a teenager, that's going to really speed up how quickly that bucket's going to fill up. But no matter what, for all of us, as we get older, this bucket keeps filling up with water. At some point, that bucket's going to overflow.
Correct.
Now, how and when that overflows, I like to use the term a trigger event. Typically, there's a trigger event that happened, whether that's your basement flooded, maybe you just lost your mother or father father. Maybe you got divorced. There's some sort of event that your body is like, okay, and the bucket overflows.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to mold, typically it is something like you've been diagnosed and have Lyme's and have had it for years. For the most part, it wasn't really giving you too many issues, but then you get exposed to mycotoxins and that bucket overflows. That's your body saying, hey, we've had enough.
Correct. And that's where having a physician who's mold literate or a healthcare professional who's mold literate in the picture becomes important, because you might want to assess the load you're at before you do all the things to fix the mold.
Exactly. And like I said, my fellow professionals probably hate it when I say this, but we're just trying to lower that burden, lower the level of water in that bucket. And, you can't expect to empty that bucket. Like, that's virtually impossible if you're comparing it to mold exposure. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is, like, you have to have a come into Jesus talk with yourself and be like, where are we going to put this money? And how are we going to approach this? I'm not saying by any means you don't have to do all the steps. I'm just saying I understand that financially, or even a lot of my clients, it's inconvenience, which to me is a little bit odd. But at some point, you have to draw the line and be like, how far are we willing to go with this?
Well, and you said this in your books, a lot of everybody's homeostasis point is different. Some people will get sicker with different exposure levels than others, and they could be in the same household and one is sick due to mold and one is not sick at all.
Yeah.
And so the load differs from person to person, which is why you always say medical testing should be done in addition to environmental testing. But people may not understand what is the difference, especially with mycotoxin testing, between the medical testing and the environmental testing.
It's interesting you bring that up, because most of the time when I ask my clients, have you done environmental mycotoxin testing? They're like, yeah. And so I ask them, I'm like, send me your results. Well, they send me the results from a urine test.
So that's medical.
Yeah. And I think my point is I think a lot of people hear mycotoxin testing and they always assume it's only the medical side.
Yeah.
It's important to have both the medical and the environmental. And for our listeners, if you're asking, well, why is that important, Steve? For me, it's important, going back to a money perspective. What if you're being exposed to mycotoxins at work, but you're putting all the money into your home?
Yeah, you're wasting money.
Yeah. I'm not saying that if you had a mold infestation in your home, that it wasn't causing the negative health effects. All I'm saying is it's a way for us to tie the two together. Like, okay, we have this type of mycotoxin in the body. We did an environmental mycotoxin test, and that same mycotoxin's in the home. Now, if we don't find that in the home, does that mean that it's not your home making you sick? That's a huge leap that I wouldn't take. But does that make sense?
It does make sense. But when I hear, medical testing is testing done to determine your load in the body. And then environmental testing is testing for mycotoxins that's done to assess the presence of mycotoxins in the home, right? That's the major difference. But I hear so many people focus on ERMI, like that is the only environmental test to use. Does the ERMI measure mycotoxins?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh.
That's the interesting part. It's only a mold species test.
Okay.
So unless that lab has started doing, that's why I'm careful saying it, unless they have started doing environmental mycotoxin assessments, no, I've never seen an ERMI that shows the actual mycotoxins.
So that's interesting, because when I hear and read about people going, my ERMI score is this, so I can't do that, or my ERMI score is too high, I'm under the assumption that ERMI just assesses every single thing, including mycotoxins.
No.
Okay.
No, and so going back to the environmental tests, so the EMMA test is with real-time labs.
Okay.
And real-time labs, I don't know how long they've been doing it, but they've been doing the medical mycotoxin testing, which is a urine test. They've been doing that, I'm pretty sure, for probably decades. When they created the EMMA test, they obviously used a lot of the research and white papers from that to create the environmental test. When you do an EMMA test, you're actually getting two different reports. One is a mold species, which is the ERMI. The other one is the mycotoxins. So it's actually two different reports.
Oh, wow.
But when you do, like with Hayes Microbial, when you do their mycotoxin test, and I I haven't really used them. I talked to them, but I haven't really used them for just whatever reasons I'm not going to discuss over a podcast. But they only report the mycotoxins. Respirator Labs, I believe, only reports the mycotoxins.
Okay.
So once again, this is preference, but the reason I prefer an EMA is it's both given us the qPCR, which tells us a mold species, and it gives us the mycotoxins.
So it's giving you both. You get two reports as real-time labs, whereas with Respirator and Hayes Microbial, you're only getting one report.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I want to be clear, because Paul with real-time labs is probably like, whoa, Steve, hold on. And I need to get him on the podcast.
Yeah.
Things have been a bit crazy, but the real-time labs they do them separately for a lower price. Mm-hmm. So that is an option. I just want to be clear with our listeners. You can do only the mold species. And I believe you can do only the mycotoxins, but the EMA kit is both.
So why, as a mold expert, do you think it's valuable to have both reports, both tests with the EMA?
Once again, so I just had a client recently that I spoke to, did a discovery call. She's in a brand new home. She's had 3 inspections. She's done an ERMI. She's done air testing. She's done surface sampling. And there are some red flags. And so she reached out and she's like, hey, Steve, can you help me figure out what's really going on? The reason I told you all the things that she's had done is it's all pieces to the puzzle that we put together and go, okay, so you've had not just an ERMI. Mm-hmm. Or you only had an inspection. It's important to have all of this information so that we can make a fair assessment. Now, do I believe she has no problems and never will? Of course not. There are some red flags that are a bit concerning, but on the other hand, do I think she has a major problem? No.
Okay.
So that's why it's important to do all these different tests. And we've talked about it quite often. There is no silver bullet test. So for our listeners, if you're like, hey, I'm going to go buy this EMA kit, which you can buy from our website, it costs more than what you can buy it from the lab. But if you go buy it from the lab, you don't get my interpretations. But let's say they're saying, hey, this is Steve saying the EMA is the best test out there. I'm going to go buy this test. In a couple weeks, it's going to answer all my questions. It's not. It's only one piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
And so at least real-time labs, when you opt to do both testing, gives you a few more pieces of the puzzle taken at relatively the same time, those samples. So you can see in real time what was going on at the time of the testing.
And keep this in mind for our listeners. So the EMA test, just like an ERMI, is a piece of gauze. So here's a little paper towel sitting here. Could you imagine if we went throughout our home, and our home's 3,600 square feet, which I always recommend up to 2,000. But let's say we took this and we went around and gathered dust throughout the entire home. And let's say the EMA results come back. And I want to be clear too with our listeners, there's no standards per se. There's not a number it has to be over for us to say you're fine. It's just information. But let's say it comes back really high for the mold species count of Stachybotrys. And as far as the mycotoxins like the otratoxin A or trichothecenes, let's say that comes back it actually for the EMA report will only say present. How do I know where that mold problem is? If I went throughout the entire home. See, so it's a very important subject you bring up. It's not a perfect test. But on the other hand, we can see that we have those issues in the home. Now, if we want to start narrowing it down, we could do an EMA test in just our basement. Mm-hmm. Or we could do an EMA test on only the main level. You could hire a IEP that comes in and does air testing, which, once again, for the people that are like, well, I've heard air testing's not accurate. Well, none of them are that accurate. It's just a piece of the puzzle. You could start to narrow things down. Going back to that discovery call, this woman had done numerous things as far as her due diligence. If I only had just one set of test results, that wouldn't really help me. So I want to be clear with our listeners, like, don't just think an EMA is the end all be all. You still have to get an IEP involved.
Absolutely. So then there's no perfect test, obviously, whether it's EMA or ERMI or what have you. And you've talked about the fact that you can use real-time labs or Respir Air Lab or Hayes Microbial to test mycotoxins. What are your recommendations to people who are out there saying, okay, so should we do some mycotoxin testing? Should we evaluate our home for mycotoxins, whether we've had a mold issue in the past or a mold issue presently? Like, what do we do about this mycotoxin thing?
I would always start with an on-site inspection.
Okay.
But the rabbit hole our listeners going to go down, depending on your IEP, then, we would have to recommend some sort of testing. And my point is at the end of the day, if you're thousands of dollars into this, then you're looking at me and you're like, well, Steve, that's $3,000 I could have spent on remediation. What I'm trying to get at is, from what you just brought up, it is important to do the medical side and the home side. Okay. Because, and it's interesting, I keep going back to this client. At the end of the day, my question for her was, are you feeling worse? And she's like, I don't feel any different. Remember, I already said she moved into a brand new home, not new to her, new construction last year. At the end of the day, you have to assess what's her health doing. The home appears to not be problematic, which, once again, you never know. I didn't physically inspect it. We all inspect differently. But at the end of the day, if you have the medical mycotoxin testing, we're not just going on how you feel. We're going on medical data. And then if you do the home side, which you don't have to do the environmental mycotoxin testing, you could do just air testing. I wouldn't recommend it, but we could compare the two.
Absolutely. So then what's your call to action for people in general? I think you just went over it.
Yeah, I just said it. Like, do the proper testing.
Okay.
And there's no silver bullet test. There's no silver bullet test at home, no silver bullet test on the medical side.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to say that any testing you do, you want to be sure you also have a solid interpretation of what the results mean. I can't tell you the number of times people will do testing and they have no clue. Is this normal? What does it mean? There's so many questions around. A test means nothing, the results of a test, if you don't know how to interpret the results. Right. Which is why I like the fact that at cnccontractorservices.com, you do sell the EMA kits that come with your interpretation.
Yeah. And what's interesting, I'm going to get off subject here real quick, but it's no different if you go and do full panel blood testing. When you get that report back, how much sense does it really make?
None, without interpretation.
Without a medical professional, it'll say, okay, your creatinine levels are high or your uric acid's high. But for the most part, unless you're trained in the medical field, I don't know if it's a phlebotomist or whatever, but you don't really even understand what those numbers are telling you.
Correct.
Like, you can say, oh yeah, that's high, or no, that's low. But like you said, our listeners can go to our website. They can buy the EMA kits. They are more expensive than if you buy it at the lab. But on the other hand, you get my interpretations.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also, on cnccontractorservices.com, find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.